Okay. So wet rice cultivation, this is the major cultural influence that arrived to Jomon, Japan from China around 300 BC. And so the arrival of wet rice cultivation, of cultivating and eating rice, marks the end of the Jomon period and the beginning of our second period we're studying, the Yayoi period. Okay? And this lasted from 300 BC to 300 AD. And because of the presence of wet rice cultivation, new cultural influence from China, Yayoi culture automatically becomes more sophisticated, more advanced than the Jomon culture because you have the presence of this new cultural influence that was not there before. And automatically, with the introduction of rice, of wet rice cultivation, Japan becomes an agricultural society, okay? Because you now need to cultivate this crop, right? You can't, rice just doesn't grow on trees by itself. You actually have to do something in order to cultivate the rice. And rice becomes important not only as a food, but also as the main economic staple of society, okay? So the person with more rice has more to eat, has more money, right? Because they can also sell the rice, okay? And if you don't have rice, you can't sell it, so you don't have money, right, per se. And you also don't have food. So rice becomes the main economic staple of Japanese society, and that really continues until modern day, pre-modern period. People now became farmers because you need people to cultivate the rice and the crops. And if you're moving from place to place, that means you cannot cultivate, right? Your rice crop is not going to grow because you need to do something to it. You need to cultivate it, right? So if you're moving from place to place like the Jomon did, even if it's semi-permanent, you would still be moving quite regularly. And so if you're moving around even once a year, how are you going to keep your rice paddy, your rice crop to grow? How are you going to cultivate it? And so people begin now, because of rice, because they need to be in one permanent area tending to their rice crops and living there permanently, these farmers now begin to settle in permanent villages. Okay, so that's how villages are formed, because they're living there and they're looking after their rice crops. They need to be in one place to cultivate the rice. So as we see communities develop thanks to rice cultivation, social classes also begin developing in the Yayoi period. And that's because people who owned more rice, had more to eat, had more money, they're the upper class, right? More rice equals more prosperity. People who don't have as much rice are the have-nots. They're the lower classes. So, might be fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your view, Yayoi period sees the beginning of social stratification in Japan, unlike the Jomon where there was no social class. Everybody was in the same boat, okay? And because people begin settling in villages to begin looking after their rice paddies, communities begin developing in the Yayoi period. You have this community versus another community, small places, small permanent, this time completely permanent communities and villages are being settled. And rice cultivation, farming, it wasn't just one person becomes a farmer and then, everyone else doesn't do anything in your family. It was a family effort. So everyone from young to old had some kind of role in the rice cultivation process. Because it is a complicated process, it takes time, and so you need everybody to be involved. It was a family affair. But there we go. It's subtle, but it's still beautiful, and that's really a common theme of Japanese art, where the understated is a lot more beautiful and considered a lot more beautiful, a lot more elegant than some gaudy piece of art or some gaudy piece of pottery. So we see the beginnings of that very subtle, very understated art in the Yayoi pottery back in 300 BC. Okay. So wet rice cultivation was really the main cultural influence that came in from China, from the Asian mainland. Okay, so that made a big deal during the Yayoi period. But you also have two important metals that were introduced from China that did not exist in Japan before, and during the Yayoi period. And these two metals were bronze. Okay, this was used for ornamental purposes, for design. Okay, so that's what bronze was used for. Not really for work, just for design, for looks. Iron was also introduced, and iron is important because it was used for making weapons. And when you need weapons, because as you have social classes developing, you have rice, you want to keep your rice and protect it from getting stolen by somebody. So weapons come in handy because you want to defend yourself and your family. So as society becomes more complicated, you also have to think about certain things that the Jomon didn't have to think about before necessarily. And iron that comes in from China was used for making weapons to protect oneself. Bronze was only used for design and ornamental purposes.